I was 28 years old the first time I sat in the Velthari Throne's grand convocation, and I remember thinking, before everything else happened, before the folder, before Dorn's 4 words, that the chamber was the most beautiful room I had ever been permitted to enter. That word, permitted, was doing considerable work even then. You did not simply arrive at the grand convocation. You traveled under sanction, filed a transit declaration, awaited the throne's acknowledgement, traveled again under sanction to the secondary way station at Arith's Reach, filed another declaration, waited again, and arrived on a specific day at a specific docking corridor assigned to you by the throne's harbor secretariat. If any segment of that chain was incomplete, or if the throne's secretariat had not yet processed your declaration, which could take 3 weeks or 6 or indefinitely, depending on factors no one in the secretariat would specify, your ship would be turned away at the cordon. Politely. The throne was always polite about it. I had been on the transit declaration chain for 11 weeks before the clearances came through. My supervisor at the diplomatic auxiliary, a man named Forsyth who had been making this trip for 19 years, told me that 11 weeks was fast. He said this without irony. I was a second aide in the office of Ambassador Cael Dorn, which meant I sat at the far end of the secondary delegation table, took notes, and handled the translation cache when the primary interpreter was occupied. I was not important. The throne's harbor secretariat would not have known my name from anyone's, and that was fine. I was there to observe and to learn. I learned a great deal in the end, only not what I had been told to expect. The grand convocation ran along a corridor the Velthari called the Hall of Precedence, a long nave of tiered galleries faced in pale stone the color of bone, with a vaulted ceiling from which pendant lights hung at intervals warm amber, casting everything in the tone of old parchment. The stone had been quarried, according to the architectural notes in my pre-session briefing packet, from a formation in the throne's home system that had been worked continuously for 600 years. The Velthari were not a people who wasted gestures. Every surface in the hall communicated the same thing: permanence. The same families in the gallery today as had sat in it 3 generations ago. The same amber light falling on the same polished floor. The same copper sigil, the 6-pointed compass rose, the throne's oldest symbol, hanging above the high dais at the far end, worn smooth at its edges by centuries of ceremonial handling. The throne itself was at the far end, the potentate's seat elevated on polished black basalt above the 7 archon seats arranged in a shallow arc below it, each archon seat slightly lower than the one to its right as you faced the dais, a gradient of precedence made literal in the architecture. The galleries were full when we entered. Representatives from 37 compact states, a dozen tributary blocks, 4 observer delegations. The Velthari Throne controlled transit sanction rights across 9 corridors, and anyone who needed to move goods or ships through those corridors had a seat in this hall, whether they wished it or not. We were shown to the secondary table on the left side of the floor. The primary human delegation, Ambassador Dorn, Deputy Chief Myra House, and the senior commercial attaché, a quiet man named Andre who I had never heard speak above a murmur, took their seats at the primary table slightly ahead of ours. I placed my translation cache on the table, opened my notation board, and looked up at the dais. The potentate had not yet entered. The archons were in their seats, talking among themselves in the low, buzzing murmur that I would later learn was their informal register. The Velthari had several modes of speech: a formal declarative mode for official proceedings, a transactional mode for business, and this third one that Forsyth described as among themselves before the show. The informal mode was not translatable with precision. My cache rendered it in approximations, stripped of the tonal markers that, for the Velthari, carried a third of the meaning. I noted this in my translation log and would continue to note it throughout the session. The particular irony that a regime built on documentation used a mode of speech designed to leave no documentation. The potentate entered from a side passage behind the dais. The Velthari were bipedal and roughly human in proportion, but taller, broader at the shoulder, with a distinctive cartilaginous ridge running from the crown of the skull down to the base of the neck that flushed a deep violet when they were agitated. In quieter states, neutral, composed, thinking, it was pale gray, almost colorless. The potentate's was a pale gray that morning, so light it was nearly white. She moved to the high seat without looking at the floor, a practiced glide that I recognized as the kind of motion you acquire only after decades of being watched. She sat, touched the copper sigil pendant that hung at her collarbone, a gesture I did not yet understand but would come to, and the hall went quiet. I had been briefed on the agenda. Every delegation had. The first item was routine, quarterly transit corridor status reports from the 7 archons. The second item was the vote on the Mutual Accord Renewal, a 10-year framework that governed the terms under which compact states could appeal transit sanctions imposed by the Throne's corridor administration. The third item, the one that had driven the full gallery attendance and the weeks of anxious internal correspondence in Dorn's office, was the vote on Compact Measure 11, a proposal to make permanent and irrevocable the existing transit sanction architecture that the Throne had imposed on human shipping over the preceding 41 years. The measure had been in formal circulation for 3 years. It had enough declared support, by the count of every analyst Dorn's office employed, to pass on a first vote. 17 compact states had already submitted their positions in writing. Permanent transit sanction architecture meant that no human ship would ever travel without explicit, filed, case-by-case Throne authorization, not through any of the 9 corridors. The corridors covered the main transit routes between Earth and every settled station, waypoint, and installation in the outer network. To move without corridor access was technically possible in some cases and not possible in others. To move through the corridors only on explicit case-by-case authorization was to move at the pace of bureaucratic clearance, which, given the Secretariat's established processing times, meant sporadic, conditional access, always revocable, never reliable. Forsyth had been filing transit declarations for 19 years. He knew what that pace meant across a generation. I knew the agenda. I had read the briefings and the counter-briefings and the internal modeling and the private notes that Andre had circulated through Dorn's office in the weeks before the session, and the older precedent files that someone, I did not know who yet, had pulled from the auxiliary's archive and left, unmarked, in a folder on the secondary desk in the delegation's workspace. I had read all of it. I understood the stakes in the abstract the way a person of 28 understands stakes she has not yet lived through, which is to say, I understood them as a description of consequences rather than as a weight. What I did not understand, not yet, was why Dorn had been so calm the entire voyage out. He had not been animated. He had not been tense. He had reviewed his files with the detached thoroughness of a man rereading something he had already fully committed to memory, which I eventually understood was exactly what he was doing. He had answered my procedural questions with patient brevity. He had eaten well and slept on schedule, both of which struck me, at 28, as mildly improbable given the circumstances. He had looked out the observation port once for a long time during the approach to Arith's Reach, but I could not have told you what expression he wore. When I asked Forsyth, near the end of the voyage, whether there was something about the session I was missing, Forsyth looked at me for a moment and then said, "Just take good notes." That was all. He was 54 years old, Forsyth said, and had been in active service for 30 years. He had a quality that Forsyth described as accumulated patience. I wrote that down. I had a habit, even then, of writing down things that seemed to carry more weight than I yet understood. The first item ran for an hour and 12 minutes. I kept notes throughout, as instructed. The corridor reports were standard. 3 corridors had experienced routing delays in the prior quarter due to debris field migration. One had had its designated way station upgraded. One had had its maximum transit weight ceiling reduced pending a structural review. These things happened every quarter. The archons delivered their reports in the declarative mode, each running approximately 10 minutes, each followed by a brief acknowledgement from the potentate. I noticed, noting everything, that none of the 7 archons addressed the human delegation at any point. We were observers of a system that governed us. That was the architecture. That was what the entire hall was built to make visible. The accord renewal passed on a voice affirmation. I wrote that down. Then the potentate called the third item. She said it in the declarative mode, which my translation cache rendered as, "The Grand Convocation will now take up Compact Measure 11, the instrument of perpetual sanction architecture. Before the measure proceeds to vote, the throne will exercise its right of preliminary record under the Transit Code." She touched the sigil pendant again and said, "The register of unsanctioned movement will be read." I had not been briefed on the register. Forsyth, seated 2 chairs down from me at the secondary table, did not change expression. I looked at him. He was watching the dais. I looked back. One of the archons, the third, whose portfolio covered the transit declaration apparatus, produced a document. Physical, not projected. This was traditional. The throne had been reading the register in physical form since the register was established. The pages were bound in pale cord, and there were many of them. The archon stood, adjusted his reading posture, and began. The register was a list of human ships, human delegations, and human cargo convoys that had, over the prior 41 years, traveled within the 9 corridors without complete transit sanction documentation. The archon read each entry in the declarative mode: vessel designation, date of transit, corridor used, and the specific sanction provision violated. Each entry was several lines long. There were hundreds of them. I understood by the second page what the register was for. It was not administrative housekeeping. It was not a legal prerequisite to the measure vote, as the Transit Code's preliminary record provision technically required. It was a roll call of shame, read before every compact state in the gallery, before every observer delegation, before the human delegation itself. This was the throne saying, "Here is the record of their defiance. Here is the pattern of their disregard for this architecture. Here is why the measure is a correction and not an escalation, a response to a documented behavior rather than an imposition." Every violation was technically accurate. Each one had been a ship or convoy or delegation that had traveled short of complete documentation. Most of them, I knew from the briefings, had been documentation lag cases, secretariat processing delays of weeks or months beyond the stated standard emergency transits where the provision process had stalled. But the register did not say that. The register said they moved without sanction, over and over, vessel by vessel, year by year, for 41 years. The reading took 37 minutes. I kept notes throughout. I wrote down entry counts by corridor, cross-referenced against what I remembered from the briefings about processing backlogs. I wrote down when the gallery shifted, those ambient adjustments in posture and position that large rooms make when their attention is directed through a long recitation. I watched Dorn and House and Andre at the primary table and wrote that they did not react, meaning they held the same posture they had maintained all morning, facing the dais, composed. I watched the potentate and wrote that her expression did not change. I watched the third archon and noted that somewhere around the 12th page his cartilaginous ridge began to flush a pale violet, not deep, not the full agitation color, but something in transition. I had not seen that particular shade on a Velthari before and did not know what to call it yet. I wrote, "The archon's ridge is shifting color, purpose unclear." When the archon finished, he closed the document, retied the pale cord, and set it on the dais before him. He remained standing. The potentate said, "The record of the Grand Convocation will reflect the register of unsanctioned movement as entered. Compact Measure 11 is now called for deliberation. The throne recognizes the right of delegation address before the vote. Delegations wishing to address the convocation may signal now." The protocol was to place a small indicator card on the edge of your table. Several delegations placed cards within the first few seconds. I watched Dorn's hands. He reached to the right of his notation board, picked up the indicator card that had been sitting there since before the session opened, placed in advance, I realized, meaning he had known he would speak, and set it on the edge of the table. Deliberate, unhurried. There were 3 statements before his. The first was from the Arath Compact, supporting the measure, their representative citing corridor management efficiency, and the administrative burden of conditional sanction reviews. The second was from the Saravath Trade Bloc, which entered a conditional abstention pending the working group recommendations that the measure itself proposed. The third was from a small compact state in the outer corridors, whose representative spoke for 4 minutes in a technical register that my cache flagged as contract liability terminology. I wrote down what I could. Then the potentate recognized the human delegation. I had been watching Dorn since the address period opened. He had been doing almost nothing visible, which I was beginning to understand was not the absence of preparation but its opposite. He had not opened a display. He had not consulted his notation board. He had reached under the primary table at some point during the third address and produced a folder physical, like the Archon's register, bound in plain dark cord, and set it flat in front of him. He had not opened it. He stood. He was a large man, Cael Dorn, not tall in the way that is immediately obvious, but broad, solid, with gray at the temples, and the careful, unhurried posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where posture was read as carefully as words. He wore the service's standard formal attire, dark blue coat, no insignia beyond the small Earth mission crest at the breast, no decorations, no rank markers beyond what the crest indicated. He looked at the dais for a moment after he stood, in a silence that in the grand convocation's formal mode was unusual enough that I felt the gallery notice it. He spoke in the declarative mode. He said, "The human delegation thanks the throne for the courtesy of address and for the completeness of the register." He opened the folder. He said, "With the convocation's permission, the human delegation will also read from a document before the vote." He did not wait for the permission to be formally confirmed. He looked down at the first page, adjusted it slightly, not nervously. The adjustment was the adjustment of a man lining up text he intends to read precisely, and began. He said, "Corridor 2 South, Standard Transit Lane, Transit Year 4, Early Season, Cargo Convoy Designation Heart 7, operating under provisional sanction pending Secretariat processing of documentation filed 49 days prior to intended transit date. Secretariat processing had not cleared at time of transit. Convoy traveled under provisional status. Convoy encountered an unsealed debris field in the outer approach to the corridor's mid-station, an approach that the Throne's own corridor maintenance report, as reported this morning by the 4th Archon in the quarterly status report under the first agenda item, had listed as cleared in the prior quarter's maintenance cycle. Heart 7 lost 2 crew members and its lead transport in the debris field. The surviving vessels completed transit. The Secretariat processed the original declaration 11 days after the transit event. The transit violation was entered in the register. The crew members' names were not. He turned the page. He said, "Corridor 4 North, Station Approach Lane, Transit Year 9, 3rd Quarter, Diplomatic Courier Vessel Reach 3, carrying medical resupply to the Earth installation at the Reachway Station, traveling under emergency transit provision as authorized under Transit Code Subsection 4, Article 11. Emergency transit provision exists precisely for this circumstance. The Secretariat denied activation of emergency provision on grounds of incomplete prior declaration history associated with the vessel's operating registry. Reach 3 traveled without sanction. The installation received its medical resupply 22 days after the original scheduled arrival. 7 personnel at the installation did not survive the 22 days. The transit violation was entered in the register. The personnel's names were not." He turned the page. He continued. The pace was different from the register. The third Archon had read at the measured clip of someone working through a long administrative document in the formal mode, voice even, entries proceeding at a regular interval. Dorn was reading more slowly, and his entries were longer. Where the Archon's register had listed corridor, vessel, date, provision violated, Dorn's document listed corridor, vessel, date, provision violated, and then what the violation had cost. The mechanics of the sanction architecture, and then what it had taken. I wrote as fast as I could. I was using notation shorthand I had developed over 3 years in the service, and I was still falling slightly behind, which had not happened to me before in a session. By the 5th entry I had noticed that the gallery had gone still in a way it had not been during the register. Not the settled attention of an audience following an expected recitation, something more careful than that. The kind of stillness that is itself a form of response. That means the room is processing something it had not anticipated needing to process. I wrote, gallery still, different from register reading. I noted when someone in the upper gallery coughed once and no one in their row moved. I noted that Dorn's voice had not changed in register or pace from the 1st entry to the 5th. Clinical precision, the declarative mode used for official statement, not the mode of argument, not the mode of appeal, not the mode that the Velthari associated with emotional weight, the mode of record. The mode of this happened, and this is what it cost, and this has been documented, and I am now documenting it here, in this chamber, before every compact state and every observer and the potentate and all 7 archons, and it is now part of this session's record. He turned the page. He said, Corridor 7 Central, Commercial Lane, Transit Year 15, First Season, Freight Consortium Navarre, 12 vessels, traveling under sanction renewal documentation filed 63 days prior to intended transit date. Standard processing window listed by the Secretariat at 14 to 21 days. Documentation had been in processing for 63 days without clearance. The consortium could not delay further without breaching its delivery contracts at the destination way station, contracts which were themselves subject to the way station's regulations, which did not amend their deadlines to account for Secretariat lag. Consortium lead ship Navarre Prime traveled in advance of documentation clearance to establish customs presence at the destination way station, as required by that way station's standing arrival regulations. Navarre Prime was detained at the Throne's corridor cordon for 17 days pending documentation clearance. During the 17-day detention, the destination way station's customs presence deadline elapsed. The consortium lost its installation contract. 11 employees lost their posts. The documentation cleared on day 4 of the detention. The Navarre Prime remained detained for a further 13 days, while administrative confirmation of the clearance was transmitted and processed. The transit violation was entered in the register. The contract loss was not. The 11 names were not. He turned the page. I stopped writing individual summaries somewhere around the 8th entry and shifted to a more compressed notation. Corridor, vessel or group, year, cost, lives or posts or contracts or access. Final line not in register. Every entry ended the same way. The register contained the violation. Dorn's document contained everything the architecture of the violation had cost. This was not the same document. This had never been the same document. By the 10th entry, the 3rd Archon's cartilaginous ridge had settled into a steady violet. Not the transitional pale shade I had noticed during the register reading, a deeper, more fixed tone. He had not stood. He had not spoken. None of the Archons had moved from their seats. The address protocol gave the floor to the speaking delegation until it was seated, and Dorn showed no sign of seating. The Archon was looking at Dorn with an expression that my translation cache offered no useful annotation for, which happened when the cache encountered a facial configuration outside its probability model, meaning the expression was either unusual for the species or unusual for this particular context. I looked at Forsyth. He had not opened his notation board. He was watching the dais with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his face was the face of a man who was holding something very still inside himself. 19 years of transit declarations. 11 weeks was fast. I thought about that, and then I went back to taking notes, because that was what I was there to do. Dorn turned the page. He read past page 15. He said at one point, I did not note the precise page, only that it was past the midpoint of the first third corridor 1 prime. The central corridor. Transit year 22, mid-season. Emergency evacuation convoy, 14 vessels, operating under emergency transit provision activated under Transit Code subsection 4, Article 11, the same provision that existed for exactly this purpose. Evacuation from the Halland Station complex, which had experienced a catastrophic systems failure. The Secretariat declined activation of the emergency provision on grounds that the declaration of emergency had not been co-signed by the Throne's resident corridor inspector, as required under activation procedures. The Throne's resident corridor inspector was not present at Halland Station at the time of the emergency because the same systems failure that had necessitated the evacuation had also affected the inspector's vessel at its berth. The convoy traveled without sanction. 13 of 14 vessels completed transit. The 14th was turned back at the cordon, and its passengers transferred under duress at the cordon station. The transit violation was entered in the register. The passengers' names were not. The inspector's name was not. He turned the page. He said, Corridor 5 South, Outer Transit Lane, Transit Year 18, Late Season, Research Vessel Terran 9, affiliated with a joint Earth-Arith scientific body, traveling to an observation installation in the Outer Corridor Reach. Documentation filed under a bilateral accord provision that had, without notice to either filing party, been suspended 6 months prior pending a review of bilateral accord eligibility criteria. The suspension had not been communicated to the Arith signatories or to the Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary. Terran 9 was turned back at the cordon. The research team aboard had a scheduled observation window of 11 days, corresponding to a specific transit event that occurred once every several years. The observation window elapsed. The research was not recovered. The data from that window does not exist. The transit violation is in the register. The research is not. He turned the page. He said, Corridor 8 North, Secondary Transit Lane, Transit Year 24. A family compact, 6 individuals, Earth citizenship, carrying goods under a private trader's authorization, filed documentation under a provision the Secretariat reclassified during the processing period from standard to specialized. Specialized processing required additional documentation that the family was not notified they needed until day 91 of a stated 14 to 21 day standard window. The family submitted the additional documentation on day 93. Processing began again. They made transit on day 142. Their goods, which were perishable, did not survive the delay. The loss is not in the register. He turned the page. He kept going. I had by now given up attempting to match individual entries to the briefing files I had memorized. There were too many entries, and I was understanding, as the page count climbed, that the briefing files had not contained all of them. The briefings I had been given had described the Transit Monitoring Division's archive in summary terms, a decades-long documentation effort, several hundred entries, a comprehensive record. I had read that description and formed an image of the document from it. The image I had formed had been accurate in its broad parameters and entirely inadequate in its specifics. Several hundred entries over 41 years read as a statistic. Each entry read individually, in the declarative mode, corridor by corridor, year by year, cost by cost. Each one was a thing that had happened to someone, and Dorn was reading every one of them. The room had been still for a long time. A few delegates in the gallery had begun to write. I could see the motion of notation boards and styluses in my peripheral vision when I looked up, but most were not writing. They were listening. The gallery of precedence was a room designed by people who understood how rooms work, how the curved stone and the vaulted ceiling and the amber light shaped attention and duration, how a person could sit in it for a long session and not feel the time passing because the room itself absorbed time gracefully. I had noticed this during the corridor reports. I noticed it differently now. Dorn said, at one point, on a page I could not number from where I sat, Corridor 3 East, Transit Year 28, a medical transport vessel operating under humanitarian provision, a provision that existed in the transit code and had been invoked successfully 11 times in the prior decade. The Secretariat denied the humanitarian provision activation on grounds that the filing entity, an Earth medical nonprofit, had an outstanding documentation dispute from 2 years prior, a dispute that was itself in processing and had not been resolved. The humanitarian provision was not activated. The medical transport waited. The dispute was resolved 43 days later in the nonprofit's favor, as the documentation had been correctly filed, and the dispute had resulted from an error in the Secretariat's processing records. The transport traveled 43 days after its intended departure. The persons it was transporting received care 43 days late. 2 of them did not survive the wait. The dispute resolution is in the Secretariat's own records. The transit violation is in the register. The 2 names are not. He turned the page. By the time he passed page 25, the second archon had begun, at irregular intervals, to look at the potentate. The potentate was not returning these looks. She was watching Dorn. Her ridge had been in its deep tone since around page 10 and had not changed since then, which I would only understand years later was a different physiological state from the violet of sharp agitation. A state more like what the Velthari experienced when confronting an arithmetic they could not dispute. Not the ridge color of anger, the ridge color of reckoning. The 7th archon, whose portfolio I had not memorized and would spend an embarrassing amount of time trying to reconstruct afterward, had placed both hands flat on the dais surface in front of his seat at some point past page 20. The gesture was not in my translation cache's behavioral library. I wrote it down and left it annotated as unknown. Dorn turned the page. He said, Corridor 2 South, Transit Year 31. I note that this corridor appeared in the first entry of this document, read today, relating to Transit Year 4. In the 27 years between those entries, Corridor 2 South appears 9 additional times in this document. Each appearance corresponds to a different vessel or convoy or delegation. Each corresponds to a different year. Each corresponds to a different specific provision of the transit code. The corridor has changed, new way station, updated maintenance protocols, reduced debris field risk in the outer approach. The architecture of the corridor has improved. The architecture of the sanction process governing transit through the corridor has not changed in 41 years. The entries are different. The mechanism producing them is the same. He turned the page. He kept going. Somewhere past page 30, one of the observer delegations in the upper gallery left. I heard the soft sound of a door and I marked the time in my notes. They did not return. No one in the hall acknowledged the departure. Dorn did not look up. He said at page 34, Corridor 6 East, Transit Year 39, I want to read this entry in full. The notation in this document flags it as requiring complete recitation, and I will honor that notation. Cargo Transit Convoy Designated Yale Cross. 14 Crew. Filing Entity, Yale Commercial Transport, a family-held operation with a 20-year transit history in Corridors 4 and 6. Transit documentation filed 214 days prior to intended transit date. Standard processing window listed at 14 to 21 days. At 100 days, filing entity submitted a follow-up inquiry. The Secretariat acknowledged receipt of the inquiry at 122 days. At 150 days, filing entity submitted a second follow-up. The Secretariat responded at 161 days with the following communication. The documentation submitted had been filed under an obsolete corridor designation that was retired 4 years prior and would need to be refiled under the current designation, which would initiate a new processing clock. The Secretariat's response also noted that the original filing had not been formally rejected because the obsolete designation still existed in the system as a legacy record, and that no automated notification of the designation change had been issued to filing entities in the period following the change, because notification of designation changes was handled on an advisory basis rather than a mandatory one. The Secretariat recommended that the convoy delay transit until the refiled documentation was processed, 214 additional days from the refiled date. The filing entity, Yale Commercial Transport, reviewed its contracts, its operating calendar, and its financial position, and determined that a further 214 days of delay was not survivable. They refiled. They also traveled under the original filing, which had never been formally rejected, only administratively misfiled due to a designation change that no one had told them about. The convoy made transit. All 14 crew members made transit. The violation was entered in the register. What the register does not contain, and what this document does, is the following. The transit violation sits as an outstanding mark on the Yale Cross Operating Registry. Every subsequent transit declaration filed by Yale Commercial Transport under that registry has been flagged as a priority review filing, which extends processing time. Priority review filings, under the Secretariat's own processing guidelines, are placed in a separate queue with an extended timeline. In 6 years of subsequent operation, no Yale Commercial Transport filing has cleared within the standard window. Processing times have ranged from 41 to 190 days. The family has been operating in a permanent state of conditional sanction. Several of them have not been home in 6 years. Home is on the other side of a corridor cordon. They are 11 names. None of them are in the register. He turned the page. The reading of the Yale Cross entry had taken approximately 8 minutes. No one in the hall had moved during those 8 minutes. After Dorn turned the page and continued, I realized I had not been writing. I had been listening. I started writing again. I am not certain what I wrote. My notation from that section of the session is less precise than the rest, which is not something I would normally permit myself. He read past page 40. He read to the end. When he reached the final page, he read the last entry in the same measured, even voice he had maintained throughout: corridor, vessel, year, provision, cost, and the notation that the names were not in the register, and then he did not immediately speak. He let the last entry stand in the air of the hall for a moment. Then he closed the folder. He set it flat on the table, squared to the edge, in exactly the position it had occupied before he opened it. He looked up at the dais. He said, "The human delegation's document contains 411 entries. The entries span transit years 1 through 41, covering each of the 9 corridors under Throne sanction authority. Each entry was drawn from records maintained by the Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary, the Commercial Attaché Office, the Transit Monitoring Division of the Joint Corridor Review, and, where available, from corroborating documentation obtained from the Throne's own corridor maintenance and Secretariat files under the disclosure provisions of Article 44 of the Transit Code. The document has been filed with the Convocation Secretariat as a formal submission to the record of this session. A copy has been transmitted to the archive of every compact state present in this chamber." He paused. He said, "We are prepared for war." He sat down. The Grand Convocation did not immediately react. What happened first was a silence of a kind I had not encountered before and have not encountered since, though I have been in a great many rooms in the 3 decades since that morning. It was not the silence of shock, which has a specific texture, the sudden intake, the collective adjustment. It was not the silence of processing, which is the silence of a room that has received information and is working through it. It was something more fundamental than either. It was the silence of a large assembly that had been handed a weight and did not yet know how to hold it. 41 years, 411 entries, names not in the register, and then 4 words. The potentate's ridge had not changed from its deep settled tone. She sat in the high seat looking at the space where Dorn's voice had been. After approximately 40 seconds, I was counting, for the same reason I had been writing throughout. It was the thing my hands knew how to do, she said, in the declarative mode. The convocation will recess. That was all. The session did not reconvene that day. I found Forsyth in the corridor outside the delegation's assigned rooms an hour after the recess was called. He was standing near a window that looked out over the transit approaches to the throne's home station, watching the ships. There were always ships in the approaches, the throne's own administrative fleet, the compact state envoy vessels, the cargo carriers holding in the transit queue, each one a filing number in the Secretariat's processing system. I had not thought about them that way before. I looked at them differently now. I stood next to him and watched them for a moment. I said, "You knew what was in the folder?" He said, "Yes." I said, "How long has the monitoring division been building it?" He said, 11 years. I did not say anything for a moment. I thought about 11 weeks. I thought about 19 years. I thought about the transit declaration forms I had filed and refiled during my first posting, the delays I had attributed to system congestion or bureaucratic inefficiency, the explanations I had accepted because they were offered, and I had not yet understood that offered explanations and accurate explanations were not the same thing. I said, "Does Dorn know all 411 entries by name?" Forsyth said, "He read the whole document, every year. He kept up with the new entries as they came in. He's been reading that document for the better part of a decade." I thought about the voyage out. The files he had reviewed with the thoroughness of a man rereading something already memorized. Because he had been carrying every one of those entries long enough that they had become part of the way he thought about corridors and sanctions, and the architecture of systems that governed movement. I asked him, why transit year 30? Why did the monitoring division start then? He said, the first draft of Compact Measure 11, internal circulation, year 30. Someone in the auxiliaries research office saw a copy of it through the disclosure provisions, same Article 44. Decided we should start keeping records of a different kind. 11 years between seeing what was coming and having the document finished. He paused. Some things take as long as they take. He did not say anything else. After a while he went back inside. I stayed at the window for a time and watched the ships and thought about the architecture of corridors and names in documents and what it meant to be patient enough to prepare for something you saw coming 11 years before it arrived. The queue of ships in the transit approach was long. They were all waiting. That was the system. That was what it had always looked like from the outside, orderly, predictable ships in a line, and what it had always cost, case by case, entry by entry, name by name from the inside. The convocation reconvened 2 days later. I was not in the main hall for most of the second session. I was in a series of small meeting rooms off the corridor of the Hall of Precedence, running translation support for conversations that I had not been prepared for, which meant I was doing my job at a level of difficulty I had not previously encountered, which is what the job does to you when you are young and good enough to be in the room, but not yet experienced enough to have seen this particular shape of conversation before. The meeting rooms were plain, stone walls, a rectangular table, chairs calibrated for multiple species, which meant they were universally slightly wrong for everyone, but designed with enough flexibility that no one was at a catastrophic disadvantage. I sat at the edge of the table with my translation cache open and my notation board beside it, and took notes on conversations that moved faster than I would have preferred, in a register that was mostly transactional mode, but occasionally slid into formal declarative when something was being said for the record. And I had to track the shift, because transactional statements and formal statements carried different legal weight, and the people in the room knew this, and used both deliberately. House ran the human side. She was 46 and had spent 12 years in corridor negotiations before becoming deputy chief, which meant she understood the transit code with the structural fluency of someone for whom its provisions were not rules to be learned, but terrain to be navigated. She had the negotiator's particular gift for patience that does not read as patience. She moved conversations forward continuously, but she moved them forward at the pace that suited her, not the pace that the other party set, and she did this so smoothly that you did not notice until later that you had been covering ground at her speed all along. Andre, the commercial attaché, spent the better part of 2 days in those rooms and barely spoke above his characteristic murmur, but every time he spoke, the throne's representatives wrote down what he said. He knew the financial architecture of the transit corridor system in specific numerical terms that the throne's own secretariat sometimes did not. The actual processing time costs to commercial operators, the cascade effect on contract timing, the ways in which documentation delay multiplied through supply chains in ways that were not visible in any single entry, but were visible in aggregate across industries. When Andre spoke, numbers became real in a different way than they had been before. I took very careful notes when he spoke. She ran them the way she ran everything, with the smooth efficiency of someone for whom the mechanics of procedure are so habitual that they require no visible attention, freeing her for the substance. I have worked with a great many deputy chiefs in my career. House is in the first 3 by any measure I know how to apply. Andre, the commercial attaché, spent the better part of 2 days in those rooms and barely spoke above his characteristic murmur, but every time he spoke, the throne's representatives wrote down what he said. The central question in those conversations, the question that the throne needed to resolve before it could decide how to proceed, was Article 44. Specifically, whether the Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary had, in fact, been entitled to obtain the Secretariat's own processing records under Article 44's disclosure provisions, and whether those records, now entered into the formal session record, were properly part of the documented evidentiary basis for the session's deliberations. They were. The provision was unambiguous. It had been in the Transit Code for 60 years. It had been used 11 times before, all in minor administrative disputes, none of them producing anything close to what Dorn's document contained. No one had thought to build 411 entries from it. The throne's legal division had apparently spent the first day of the recess confirming what the auxiliary's lawyers had known for 11 years, which was that Article 44 meant exactly what it said, and the document was legally sound. This took some time to absorb. I say this from the ground level of those conversations, not from any analytical height I possessed then. I was 28, and I was running translation support, and I was watching the shape of something very large shift, slowly, the way the architecture of a long-standing thing shifts when the load-bearing assumption under it is shown to have been different from what everyone believed. The potentate did not appear in any of the corridor meetings. She was represented by the second archon, who was, it became apparent over the 2 days of conversation, someone who understood the arithmetic of the situation clearly and was engaged in the work of translating that arithmetic into actionable terms for the broader throne apparatus. He was a careful negotiator. He asked precise questions. He did not, in those 2 days, say anything that could be construed as a concession, which was a kind of professionalism I recognized and noted. House did not offer anything that could be construed as a retreat. They were 2 people who understood the shape of the room and were working within it, and they were careful with each other in the way that people are careful when what they are handling is fragile in ways that matter. What they arrived at by the end of the second day was a framework, not an agreement, not yet, a framework for what the vote on Compact Measure 11 would not be, which in practice determined what it could be. The measure would not be brought to a floor vote in its current form. It would be referred to a working group. The working group would operate under a 180-day timeline. Pending the working group's work, the throne would implement a processing review to address documented procedural delays. Emergency transit provision would be activated automatically on declaration, without co-signature requirement, pending a review of activation criteria. These were not small things. I did not fully understand their size at the time, but Forsyth told me later, after he retired, when he became more forthcoming, that the automatic emergency provision change alone was something that the auxiliary had been attempting to negotiate into the transit code for 18 years. It went into force within the week. The convocation's final session, on the third day, was brief. The potentate announced the referral of Compact Measure 11 to the working group. She announced the processing review. She announced the emergency provision change. She announced that the formal submission entered by the human delegation would be retained in the convocation's permanent record, accessible to all compact states and observer delegations under the standard archive provisions. The measure never came back to the floor. The working group met for 179 of its allotted 180 days and returned a recommendation against advancing it to a vote, 6-1 among the Archon Council. The Throne's Secretariat began publishing quarterly processing time data within a year, something it had never done before. Average processing time came down over the following 3 years from whatever it had actually been. The published pre-review numbers were not reliable, as the review itself determined, to a consistent 10 to 13 days. Emergency provision was used 4 times in the first year, unchallenged, after decades of near inaccessibility. Andre's office spent 18 months in direct correspondence with the Secretariat's Records Division on behalf of Yale Commercial Transport. The outstanding violation was resolved, the priority review flag was lifted, and the family received a corrected transit record. I know this because Andre sent a note through the internal mail after it was done. A very short note, the kind Andre wrote, 2 sentences, and I kept it. Dorn retired 4 years after the convocation session. He went quietly, the way he had gone into the session, not dramatically, not with speeches. There was a small ceremony at the auxiliary's offices in the transit district. Forsyth gave a short address that was entirely about the procedural contributions of the Transit Monitoring Division and mentioned nothing about the folder or the forewords or any of the specific events of the session. The people in the room who had been there understood why. The people who had not been there did not need to be told that way. After the ceremony, Dorn shook hands with a dozen people, said something brief to each of them, and left. I watched him walk out and thought, this is what 30 years of this work produces. A man who does not require the room to know what he has done, who went in, read the document, said what was true, and then went home. I have been in this service for 30 years now. I'm not the person I was at 28, which is a thing you can say about yourself at 58 without it meaning anything in particular, and also a thing you can say and mean quite specifically. I have sat in chambers the throne controls and chambers it does not. I have been at tables where the weight of the accumulated record was on our side, and at tables where it was not. I have watched negotiations turn on documents that took years to build, and negotiations turn on the absence of documentation that should have existed and didn't. I have learned a great many things about the architecture of transit corridors and treaty codes, and the way that a provision buried at Article 44 of a document 60 years old can still be load-bearing, still doing the work it was put there to do, if someone has the patience to understand that it is there and the commitment to use it correctly. I have trained 6 junior aides in the years since that session. Each one has arrived the way I arrived, capable, attentive, not yet experienced enough to have sat in the room where the shape of things changed. I tell each of them the same thing I tell them before their first substantive session. Read the whole code, not just the provisions you expect to invoke. The part you are looking for and the part that will matter are rarely the same provision. Sometimes they are separated by 30 articles and 60 years, and the imagination of whoever decided to write them down. I do not tell them about the folder when I say this. The folder is in the archive now, with the session record and the formal submission copies and the Secretariat's own processing files. It is accessible under Article 44. Anyone can read it. Here is what I understand now that I did not understand then. Watching a man stand up in the most beautiful room, I had ever been permitted to enter and read for 41 minutes from a document that had taken 11 years to build. The throne had designed a system. The system was real. It had real infrastructure, real legal authority, real enforcement mechanisms at real corridor cordons where real ships were turned back or detained or fined, where real people waited and sometimes did not make it through, and sometimes lost things they could not recover. The system was also a document. It was a body of text that had been in force for 41 years, readable and citable and subject to its own provisions, including the one that allowed a counterparty to obtain the Secretariat's own records. The throne had written the transit code and the register and the processing procedures, and the emergency provision requirements and Article 44. Every piece of the architecture was text. Every piece of text could be read. What the system's designers had not accounted for was the possibility that someone would read all of it, from the outside with patience, not looking for a loophole or an escape, but asking a different question. Not, how do we avoid the register? But, what does the register not contain, and what would happen if that became part of the record too? Dorn had been asking that question for 11 years. The monitoring division had been building the answer. They had done the thing that the system's designers had not imagined anyone would do. They had read the whole document, and they had documented everything the document did not say, and they had built a second document from the gap between the two. The register was the throne's record of the violations. Dorn's document was the record of what the violations had cost. The sum of the two was the full account. The throne had brought the first document to the convocation and read it out loud. Dorn had brought the second document and read it out loud. After both documents had been read in the same room before the same audience, what remained was arithmetic. 411 entries over 41 years. Names not in the register. And then 4 words, entered into the formal record of the session in the declarative mode present tense. We are prepared. Not a threat, not a demand, not a condition. A statement of current state. The preparation had been completed. The folder was closed. The statement was in the record. The convocation now knew what was in both documents and what the documents together meant, and could decide what it intended to do with that knowledge. The throne understood that the statement was not bluster. A man who had spent 11 years building 411 entries for one session did not append a false sentence to it at the end. The preparation the statement described was real, and the throne knew it was real. And the calculation the throne then had to make was a different calculation than the one it had come to the session intending to make. The session had been designed to conclude with a vote that made the sanction architecture permanent. The session concluded instead with a referral and a processing review and an emergency provision change, and 411 entries in the permanent record accessible to every compact state in the gallery. That is how things change. Not by loudness, not by anger, not by appeals to the chamber's sense of justice, which is a thing no chamber reliably possesses. By patience, by records, by the willingness to do the work, the long, unglamorous 11-year work of documentation, until the document is complete and the room is full and the time is right. I have thought about the third archon often in the years since that session, the one who read the register, who sat through the entire reading of Dorn's counter-document without speaking, without standing, without doing anything that I could record except look at Dorn and change color slowly until his ridge settled into that deep fixed tone. He was doing the same thing I was doing, I think, in the end. He was listening. He was understanding something, entry by entry, that the register had never made clear. The register told you what people had done. Dorn's document told you what the register had cost them. You could not hear both read in the same room and arrive at the same conclusions you had held walking in. The arithmetic did not work out that way. Forsyth filed his last transit declaration the year he retired. He told me it processed in 11 days. He said this in a letter, 3 sentences, no commentary. He did not need to say anything else. I understood what 11 days meant. I understood the distance between 11 days and 11 weeks and the years of work that lay between them and the names that had accumulated in the gap. The throne read its list of names. We had been keeping ours. That is the shape of it. That is how 41 years closes into 4 words. You build the document. You wait for the right room. You read it out loud, entry by entry, cost by cost, name by name not in the register, until the account is fully visible and the arithmetic is undeniable and the room understands what it is looking at. And then you close the folder and you square it to the edge of the table and you look up at the dais and you say what is true. We are prepared. That is all you need to say.